Let me introduce myself. I'm Wojciech Jakóbik, editor-in-chief of BiznesAlert.pl, a web publication devoted to energy sphere. I'm really interested in energy, and in fact, I'm really glad to lead this panel because I need to confess that I'm leading a scientific research on energy aspects of Eastern Partnership. So I believe it is a wonderful panel for me, but not only for me, but also for you, our guests, our distinguished panelists, because we'll speak about energy security or insecurity in the context of Eastern Partnership, of course, and what would be the pragmatic energy policy? What about the politicization of energy in Eastern Partnership? As we know, in ideal world, we would have only some regulations and implementation, and then we would have some common energy policy in Eastern Partnership. But the world is not ideal yet, so we have also politicization. And in the context of energy sphere, in Eastern Partnership countries, it is obvious that we have political debate about economic or more or less political projects connected to Eastern Partnership. And to begin, I would like to introduce our distinguished guest. We have Ms. Julia Vainio from NATO Energy Security Center of Excellence. Nice to have you here. We have Ms. Anna Gumbau. She's a participant of Eastern Partnership New Generation Summit, which happened yesterday. Yeah, so wonderful to have you with us. We have Dr. Frank Umbach from European Center for Energy and Resource Security, EUCERS, and Mr. Vugar Bayramov from Center of Economic and Social Development in Baku. Ladies and gentlemen, let's have a brief talk about Eastern Partnership. Let me start with a few short remarks about the energy sphere in Eastern Partnership. We have an obvious economic and energy aspect of Eastern Partnership. It is in documents. We have the deliverables until 2020, in which we have an idea of increasing the interconnectiveness between the countries, so building the infrastructure, gas infrastructure, energy, electro-energy infrastructure. We have energy efficiency, so as we all know, the best way to save energy is not to use it, right? So we have this goal of energy efficiency also. We have renewables goal, so that, it's about energy efficiency. I made here so fast that I didn't switch off my phone yet, but I did it, and I encourage all of you to do it as well. But when it comes to the goals, we have, of course, energy security, the security of supply dimension of Eastern Partnership. We know that the security of supply to Eastern Partnership countries is important for their economic development, for their political development, also their foreign policy. And when it comes to gas policy, which we'll discuss heavily in this panel, we have this clear political dimension of gas relations in countries of Eastern Partnership. And we have diversification and other goals of energy policy of Eastern Partnership. We also have something like European Energy Community. It is called Energy Community, but it came from the idea of creating all European energy community in which we have interconnected countries, which have free gas and energy market, which is totally depoliticized. And of course, in our not so ideal world, it is still politicized, so we have a topic for a discussion. That's great. And my first question would go to Mr. Frank Umbach. And
5 minutes before.
Yes, of course, we can do it this way. If you'd like to make some introductions, of course, we need to be flexible in Eastern Partnership policy. So, okay, let's do it this way. Let's start from my left. let's start with some brief introduction about your remarks on Eastern Partnership policy when it comes to energy policy. We have like 1 hour for our discussion, so we have a lot of time, I guess.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Yes.
Hello. Is it work? Great. So thank you very much for having me here. It's a pleasure to be for once on the other side of this room. So I'm supposed to present the results of what we spoke yesterday in our discussions on the New Generation Summit. We got 2 guiding questions on how to address our recommendations, which were, first of all, how can we potentially depoliticize or geopoliticize energy, and how we can introduce or like strengthen renewables and greening the economy in Eastern Partnership countries. Those are quite difficult questions. And I think as youth representatives, it shows that the college put a lot of trust on us, which is something that as young people, like, we really appreciate. We detected many of the challenges that Mr. Jakóbik already stated in terms of energy efficiency, in terms of dependence on Russia, etc. So I will give, let's say, 3 main points. The first of all, in terms of diversification of sources, I think we need to appreciate the efforts that Eastern Partnership countries are doing in order to diversify their sources, and also how member states have been supporting them through reverse flows, through interconnectors, giving the Eastern Partnership countries the chance to tap into these other resources, and we need to continue strengthening this support. And I mean, on this regard, I'm sure that we're going to talk about Russian gas, and at some point, dependence on Russia is still unavoidable to some extent. We're talking in some cases about the triple dependence of oil, gas, and nuclear, and countries that are like 100% dependent on the Russian resources. There's something unavoidable at the short term. So we need to think of ways that we continue supporting these countries, continue the efforts on electricity, energy market integrations, especially thinking in terms of fair competition, transparency, and also ultimately thinking on consumers, which are perhaps the most important part in this sense. But thinking also long-term on the issue of decarbonization, of greener economies, we have the feeling that in the EU, decarbonization is very high in the agenda. But instead, I don't come from an Eastern Partnership country myself, but from what we were talking with colleagues from Armenia, from Azerbaijan, from Ukraine, Moldova, perhaps with the exception of Ukraine, there was recently, 15th of March, there were the global marches for climate, and Ukraine, as far as we know, was the only country that was active on that and was highly reported. We noticed that decarbonization is not a priority, that climate change is not an issue, which reasons that are understandable.
In member states in European Union.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, I'm not trying to deny that, of course. But there is a lack of public awareness. So we see that it's important that EU, but especially like relevant ministries in Eastern Partnership countries, can support either through public awareness campaigns or supporting organizations that are on the ground, that through activism, through non-formal education are trying to raise this awareness. And we think that the European Union especially can take advantage of this momentum in order to fight climate change. And this is something that we heard this morning with Mr. Christian Danielsson, that said that it was perhaps the priority in this regard. And I don't know if I have much longer, or otherwise I can just
I would like
continue.
to ask you about one thing, because you said that Russian gas supply is unavoidable. So again, in ideal world, it wouldn't be a problem, right? So did you find any problems with quitting Russian gas or with dependence on Russian gas that should be solved by increased cooperation, or maybe it is up to Eastern Partnership countries to do it on their own?
I think, well, this is also a matter that does not only concern Eastern Partnership states, or also EU member states itself, starting by that. I don't have the key definitely on like how this cooperation be enhanced for sure, and I'm sure that the experts in the panel would say more than that. But definitely there must be an effort indeed for stronger cooperation in market integration, etc. Yeah, and especially support on the reforms that are already ongoing, and it has to be like both sides. Of course, like the European Union can support, but of course, like in the end, it's up to the ownership of Eastern Partnership countries. It's not that we have to like go there and like really say, but like also be realistic on what Eastern Partnership countries can do without taking into consideration there are many other challenges that we also tackled in previous panels that also involve highly the field of energy. We talked about the issue of corruption, and it came like over and over again as something that cannot be overlooked. The fact that there is not perhaps like a business environment that can enhance more initiatives of the kind. So this is something that we...
So only one question more about the climate marches. Why do you think that Ukraine was the only country that was involved in this initiative?
That's a good question. In fact, as I said, I'm not from Eastern Partnership member states myself. So, if there's actually many participants from Ukraine here, so
yeah, and I'm
sure that they will be able to give
into our
an
panel
answer.
Later on. We can discuss it together, because it's really interesting that, of course, we have the energy and climate policy inside the EU. We have the external policy like this inside of European, of Eastern Partnership, and we have a clear goal of fighting climate change inside of those deliverables I've mentioned. So it's like we all need to invest in energy transition together. I know that Ukraine has some developments in that sphere. Maybe that's the answer, that they are developed in this matter.
And a pretty strong civil society and activism
exactly.
as well.
Yeah,
I'm sure
we've seen that since 2014, definitely. So that might be the case, but maybe someone on the ground knows the situation better. But let me move the microphone to Ms. Julia Vainio. You have this experience of working inside NATO and specific department devoted to energy security. You can measure what happens on the ground. So when it comes to Eastern Partnership, we have energy policy which is under some political influence, which has clear defense dimension, and I need to speak about two different cases, like Nord Stream 2 and LNG. Those are some opportunities or challenges for Eastern Partnership countries. So when you are working in NATO and you measure everything, what did you get off your measurement?
First of all, thank you very much for the invitation, and I'd like to clarify just a bit on the fact that we work in a NATO-accredited Center of Excellence, working on energy security and at the Strategic Analysis Division there, so not particularly under the payroll of NATO, but very close. So yes, the title of today's panel discussion, Energy Security, Energy Insecurity, is very fitting, I think, and I would want to approach this from a strategical point of view of three different types of actors, which all relate to the gas industry in the region to a big extent. One of the things that I want to give you the beef of my next 4.5 minutes right up front, which is that in terms of energy security in the area, there are winners and losers. And a clear, definite winner in the recent 20 years or so has been the European Union. As a supranational alliance, it has been very precise and very courageous in its steps towards increasing the energy security, especially in the gas sector. There have been steps taken that are regulatory steps, unbundling of companies, increasing market effectiveness, infrastructural changes such as the new interconnections, new capacity, bi-directional pipelines. So no longer you have only east to west connections, but you actually have west to east connections. They have increased the transparency, dual use of different power plants, which all add up to the resiliency of the system, the gas system. There's also been a securitization of energy for quite obvious reasons, but this securitization of energy and the identification of energy not being just a commodity, but energy being as a use of power in some sense is also what has struck as a 21st century on the 21st century political agenda. We have seen acts such as the EU antitrust investigation against the biggest supplier in the region, which is Gazprom. And all these sorts of actions, infrastructural regulation, market, like I said, have tremendously increased the energy security in the region. But there's another winner in the increase of energy security from a strategical point of view. And I would like to challenge the audience a bit here, and I'd welcome all the discussion regarding this. But the other winner in terms of energy security has been, to some extent, Russia. So Russia has clearly, for historical reasons, for infrastructural reasons that are the inflexible pipeline system, have been the main supplier of gas to Europe for quite some time. They have now realized, I mean, within the next 10 years or so, a decade or so, that indeed what has been given as the status quo from before has now been challenged by these actions of the European Union. And they have started systematically, first of all, to diversify within Russia. No longer is gas and oil. With gas and oil, there is a growing nuclear sector, for example. They have tried to minimize in terms of, diversify in terms of suppliers. So no longer do you have only Gazprom, you also have Rosneft and you also have Novatek that operate in the gas sector. They have different sector specifics. For example, Novatek operates in the LNG, liquefied natural gas sector more, but you can see that there is a diversification in terms of the suppliers, in terms of the market operators. One of the reasons, this is only me guessing, but could be because of the Stockholm Arbitration Court case between Naftogaz and Gazprom that was a significant a threat also to the situation of Gazprom. And as we know, the current long-term gas contract that transit gas contract that Ukraine and the EU are currently negotiating with Gazprom. One of the preconditions from Gazprom's side so far has been that, we can continue the business as usual, we will use your pipeline, but just drop whatever the arbitration court has awarded you, so some $2.6 billion, which obviously Naftogaz, yes, exactly, is less enthusiastic to do. But so, diversification suppliers, also the minimizing of transit countries, maximizing their access to their main markets. Their main markets in Europe are Central European countries and companies. So Gazprom is trying to play its strategy in a sense where they cut the middlemen out, right? As far as EU, we have tried to deregulate. We've tried to increase our market competitiveness within the EU. And now we have a big market operator who's like, well, you know, changing their strategy, and this has caused quite a lot of outrage. And one of the things that I'd like to mention more, which is sort of a in terms of has been a deficiency so far, is that EU indeed has been the biggest market for Gazprom, but that no longer is so. It's the case with Western Siberian natural gas excavation sites. There's only pipelines to Europe. But Russia nowadays trades with other countries as well. China being one of the biggest, we might actually start seeing a situation where Gazprom starts to diversify, and the increase of the Chinese market, the increase of the market in Asia will take hold rather than, or will become more important than Europe. So they will start decreasing their investments to European side, whereas Europe is still very much dependent on gas, on a lot of things, and will continue to be so. Now, I mentioned, and I'm sorry, I think I will take 1.5 minutes more. Minutes more.
We have a deal.
I mentioned winners and losers. So who do I think are the losers in terms of energy security here? I firmly believe that it is the countries that have dropped in the middle. So my expertise of the EaP countries is on Belarus and Ukraine, and I see that both of these countries have, I'm afraid, been left on the decrease side of the energy security. This is the reason. The reason is because, first of all, Belarus is highly dependent on Russian supplies, on Russian energy supplies. They want to build, and they are building currently, a nuclear power plant with export capacity, export capabilities, but because of lack of distrust of your Western neighbors, it seems that the export capacity or the markets that the West could provide might not be there by the time the reactors are taken into commercial use. We also have the tax maneuver of Russia, where Russia is the crude oil that it provides to Belarus will be taxable in the future, and this leads to loss of revenue in Belarus. That is a very, very considerable amount of money, several billions of dollars per within the next 5 years. And then Ukraine, the other case, where we have indigenous gas production. We have Ukraine in a situation where they have a lot of electricity production through nuclear. We have Ukraine opening new gas audition markets in London. But what we are lacking is we are seeing a big hesitance of big foreign investment companies and big foreign investment oil and gas, especially gas companies investing in Ukraine. And the reason is because of the lack of transparency, then lack of predictability in the political scheme. So we don't know, they are hesitant on putting hundreds of millions of dollars in investments if they don't know what will happen in the next 5 years or happen in the next 10 years.
Or in next elections,
Exactly. So for these two countries, the energy security situation seems much more dire than their big actors left and right. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much for this introductory remark. I'd like to ask you one thing more, because you mentioned the nuclear energy and general energy cooperation with Russia. In ideal world, again, nuclear power is something neutral. It is another technology, so why not to build Ostrowiec power plant in Belarus? Why not to invest in Hungary in another reactor in packs or parts? And where is this political dimension of such projects?
So it depends on the financial instrument used, for example. We know from a historical point of view that Rosatom is a very prominent actor in the nuclear field. So it is, yes, we all know of the Chernobyl situation, Chernobyl incident, but we also know that the other reactors considered by the experts in the field, Rosatom is a reliant manufacturer and operator of nuclear power plants. But the thing is that it is also a big cash cow for the state-owned. It's a state-owned company, so it comes with a baggage that a private company would not come with. Because it is a state-owned company, it also has the opportunity to finance a lot of its projects through Russian banks, which a lot of its competitors can't do. So that's another way of looking at the situation of politicizing nuclear, whether it is good that you have a state operator or whether it is suspicious that you have a state operator.
Yeah, we've had a conversation in our web portal with experts from Turkey, where Rosatom is also building a nuclear power plant, and they said that, okay, they do it for you for free, but then it's like another embassy of Russia on ground. So this fear is present among the experts also.
There is no such thing as free lunch, so.
Of course, and they wanted to give Poland a free lunch with nuclear power. 2 years ago, they proposed Poland to, let's have a nuclear power plant together. So Poland rejected this offer, even if it's in the EU, we have regulatory framework and so on, because we have a political dimension in this cooperation everywhere, in every project, and even having European Commission involved in such projects, because we know that European Commission is in trilateral process with Ukraine and Russia on continuing the gas supplies through Ukraine. We have this intervention from European Commission on the basis of energy community, on the basis of Eastern Partnership policy, that Commission wants to help in regulatory way, in expert way, with expertise, even with money. But as you said, it is conceivable that we don't have a clear situation on the ground. And if you look at the difference between Ukraine and Belarus, especially, we have a situation in which, for example, Belarus pipelines are owned by Gazprom already, because they bought it because of some political deal in 2011. So this Belarusization of Ukrainian pipelines is also there. We've had this meeting of Viktor Medvedchuk and Yuri Boyko with Gazprom, and they made a great deal already, even before elections, to have gas prices decrease and so on. So it is really complicated topic. Before we go to Azerbaijan, we'll move to Professor Umbach, because I need you, sir, to help me with this broad approach when it comes to geopolitics, when it comes to gas negotiations with Ukraine, when it comes to Georgia, energy supply, and other cases in which you cannot not to speak about policy, because you have clear political dimension. If you could describe the situation from the geopolitical point of view.
Yeah, let me firstly thank the college and Professor Schumacher for organizing the conference here, because that gives also my students here a perfect opportunity to hear various views and insights. Secondly, let me also make at the very beginning a very general remark. When you work yourself as an analyst or a journalist or an academician on those issues, and I am doing this for more than 20 years, working on EU energy policies long before we had even a common energy policy in place, then you tend to focus on the shortcomings and the problems and the challenges. That is, to some extent, a professional disease. And we sometimes, as experts, overlook what we have achieved. And I remember perfectly back in 2006, after the first Russian-Ukrainian crisis, after 1 year, in 2007, the EU started with the adoption of a common integrated energy and climate policies. And many of my colleagues were much more skeptical than myself, by saying, well, we have so many papers produced in other policy fields, we will never make progress in this respect. And when we are looking what we have achieved today, I think this is one of the areas, certainly, where we have achieved much, much more than many people realize. Nonetheless, as you said, and we perfectly immediately were jumping in the discussion on the problems. And I will come back to your point, but I want to make that point at the very beginning.
It's not that bad, of course.
Yeah, in balancing sometimes a few. To the more broader point, I will also address not just that into the more narrow framework also of the neighborhood policy issues, but address also some of the issues which we have to address in a wider framework, as well as looking more strategically ahead, which will definitely also affect the neighborhood and ERP policies in the years and decades ahead. Looking back, we started in 2007, as I said, with an integrated energy and climate policies, and that has made everything extremely complicated. As an energy expert, I always refer to the so-called energy triangle of energy security, which we also sometimes call the energy trilemma, because it describes and follows three different kind of objectives: supply security, economic competitiveness, the most important factor, of course, for companies, as well as the environment and climate policies. And every EU member states, based on different kinds kind of historical experiences and policy agendas is following their own priorities. And instead, what an expert like me would recommend in response to of balancing these three objectives in a certain way, we very often, including my own government, has followed, put one single issue out of the trilemma at the expense of the other two. Yeah, so this is a perfect, it's not an unrealistic or it's not historically wrong when German experts, for example, making in the context of Nord Stream debates, the point, even in the Cold War, we have never made real bad experience with Russian gas. Yeah, but the problem is, of course, that other countries, Poland, Baltic states, many of the East European countries have made bad experiences. And these bad historical experiences translate into different kind of political priorities. And that has made, until today, of course, to find a coherent EU common energy policy difficult, but nonetheless we have made huge progress on that way. But there's a lot of other myth surrounding in these debates, which very often puts the issues in a very black and white picture. One of those examples is the example of renewables. Yeah, there's a myth surrounding that renewables are not just important for climate reasons, but also for energy supply security, because it would reduce dependencies on the imports of fossil fuels from unstable producer countries, such as Russia, such as the Arab states, and many others. And renewables are a domestic source and reducing our import dependencies from these countries. At a first glance, that's true. But at the same time, that's still too much overlooked, including my own country. It creates new kind of dependencies, such as on critical raw materials, as we will see, particularly in the years ahead with the digitalization technologies, which raise even more properly sensitive and difficult dependencies, as we will see. There are other myths surrounding, which I found very difficult and to totally been overlooked in the climate debates. Yeah, because the climate debates very much follow these global agendas, the Kyoto policies. And the Kyoto policy started with the basic assumption that if you reduce national emission, it automatically decreases also the global emissions, which is very often actually not the case. Yeah, if you would deindustrialize Europe by transferring our industries to the United States or to China, of course, without an energy-intensive industry, you would be perfectly reduce national emissions. But at the same time, it would not contribute to a reduction of global emission. Why? Because of environmental regulations, let's say in Russia, United States, or in Asia, are not the same as in Europe. And then you have to transport back all the goods which you still need, and all the goods are transported by ships, etc., where you need a lot of energy, a lot of CO2 emissions. So if you take and follow the so-called life cycle emission approaches, then you come very often up to a very different conclusions. And these issues are very often not addressed. The same goes on with many other debates. You mentioned Russian gas. There's the big myth still around that everybody obviously accepts the assumptions that cheap Russian gas will always compete successfully US LNG and others. Nobody is really looking how the Russian gas can be cheap. A look on the map will show you the new Russian gas for Nord Stream comes from the Yamal. This is a permafrost region of -50 degrees. Yeah, the energy demand you need to produce the gas in Yamal is several times high as in the old gas fields. And then the Russians had to build up 3,000 kilometers of new pipelines from Yamal up to St. Petersburg with a lot of gas compressors, very expensive, very energy intensive. And all these costs, for example, are not included at all in the Russian gas price it offered to the European market, because it's totally subsidized by the Russian state. If you take the other extreme case, like US LNG, where you have private companies, of course, all these private companies who have done all the investments in the new US gas fields, as well as in new pipeline connections, need to include these costs somehow and to price in these costs when they're selling this kind of gas. So you have a debate here where you compare Russian pipeline gas, highly subsidized, to much, much less subsidized US LNG. And you believe you can leave it to the market what kind of gas the Europeans will import. And most of the European countries, including my own one so far, of course, favor the cheaper version. Yeah. At the same time, that brings me to the next problem is as we facing or we focusing so much on the European problems we still have to solve on the internal market with the German Energiewende, we all tend to overlook what's actually going on a global scale. There are a number of global energy developments. You can recently use the example of shale gas, which completely ended all the discussion of peak oil as we had it for 20 years. You can take the example of China's Belt and Road Initiative, completely overlooked until very recently. And despite the globalization talks we always have, we still tend in Europe as a region which is so much energy import dependent still, 70% by gas, more than 80% for oil, even in respect to coal, with a rising import dependence even looking ahead. We still completely overlook what's going on in the rest of the world and what kind of impact these global energy developments have on their own, on our own energy policy. And that brings me to the geopolitical side. As for many years, of course, Russian gas and Russian activities in the EaP countries such as Ukraine, such as in Central Asia, have played a major role. I remember when the EU, it's the same year when we adopted a joint EU energy policy, we adopted also our first EU Central Asia policy. Yeah, and I had written at that time in 2008 a paper where I tried to highlight already how competing these strategic agendas and interests are between the EU and Russia. At a time when the German government were so much hoping and following a so-called modernization partnership with Russia. From my point of view, at that time, completely unrealistic. Nobody talks today about these things. And we have
maybe
heard
after Crimea, right?
Right. And we have heard in the morning there's a certain kind of dose of realism coming back to our EaP policies and many other things. As I started my career as a Russian expert, I came only sometimes wondering what kind of policies we have followed in the past, but what kind of assumptions we were believing in, not very much following realism. And that refers not just to Russia today, that refers to another big player, which hadn't been mentioned so much, I think, in the morning session. I was a little bit surprised, actually, and that's China. When you look to China, then not just in Central Asia, China has completely surpassed any kind of investments so far, both on the side of the EU as well as on the side of Russia, which also raises interesting questions about the Russian-China relationship. But since 2012, we have this big challenge in respect to China's Belt and Road Initiative and the 16+1 process, just highlighted during the last days with Italy.
So I need to ask about one question, because it was really, I believe it is important for Poland, ESA partnership countries. In Munich during Munich Security Conference, Ms. Merkel said something about China competition, about Nord Stream 2, that we need this cooperation with Russia to stand against Chinese question, this Chinese competition. How would you comment that? How would you relate it to what you said and those policies of cooperation through modernization and so on?
I remember at various others what Mrs. Merkel said, which I found even more problematic. But I have to say, in general, I think there's a huge change of the EU-China policies in general, including on the industry side, including in Germany, which has become much, much more critical. And I do not believe that most, even not of industry representatives, would believe that Russia is very much helping with our China policies in this respect. Yeah, and I think the mid and longer term challenge we face with China, also with investments, particularly when it comes also to digitalization issues, raising a lot of problems and challenges for cybersecurity, including for critical energy infrastructures. These challenges might be even bigger than the traditional Russian gas dependence, actually. And here again, we have a general problem, as China followed the Russian example of divide and impera, divide and rule the EU, yeah, by placing the preference to bilateral relations, which is undermining common foreign and security policy vis-à-vis Russia as well as vis-à-vis China. And that is clearly not in the EU's interest. And here again, we have developments, as I said, with the 16+1 process as part of the Belt and Road Initiative, particularly where China has institutionalized bilateral dialogues with East European countries. And when you had the EU-China decision-making agendas during the last years and coming up with also critical issues, whether that was human rights, whether that was South China Sea, then it was not a surprise that those countries who have received much of the Chinese investment as part of the Belt and Road Initiative, and which is a geopolitical design, has prevented a common political stance of the EU against China, as we have seen that already before in the case of Russia. And here again, that's my last point, as I'm a German, I'm a very critical German towards my own government. And the reason for that is that Mrs. Merkel, when you were referring to the Munich conference, was referring to multilateral, was trying to represent herself typically as a German politician as a defender of multilateralism. Yeah? Unfortunately, there's a widening gap, yeah, between these kind of rhetorics of multilateralist policies and the real content. Yeah, when you had beginning on the energy field with Nord Stream 1, with the Energiewende, and Nord Stream 2, Germany was following unilateral
exactly. And where is energy governance of European Union in this project?
We have seen that with NATO's 2% degree Celsius. And very often my German countrymen were, or fellows were, and colleagues were arguing, well, Germany is doing nothing else, and most of the other countries, such as Poland, is also defending its national interest. That raises firstly the question, what kind of national interest we are speaking about? Yeah. Because the definition of national interest of Mr. Schröder is not my definition of German national interest.
It's a personal interest, I guess.
Yes, it's a personal interest. But you can go on all the countries. I can take the example of Poland. I think many of my Polish colleagues would definitely not agree with the definition of national interest by the Polish government. And this is the case very often in most of the other countries when those national interests are not defined in a pro-European, pro-transatlantic, on a transatlantic basis. Yeah. So here again, the critical issue is here that if the biggest country in Europe, the largest and most powerful country, which is normally widely seen as a leader of the EU policies, is not following the right policies and not setting the positive examples, you cannot expect that the smaller countries are doing that. You cannot call actually for political solidarity in the refugee cases, as Mrs. Merkel did, when at the same time Mrs. Merkel repeatedly were not providing that political solidarity in many of the energy policies, such as the Nord Stream issue, such as Energiewende and many others. So here again, there are very, very critical issues we as Germans have to ask ourselves, also addressing this widening gap between our multilateralist rhetorics and the actual policies we follow here up.
Okay, so I'll ask you one question more, because it all relates to our energy governance in Eastern Partnership countries. Do we have a common ground between countries like Poland, Germany, how to govern this Eastern Partnership initiative in terms of energy? Because we, again, have these trilateral negotiations with the European Commission, and we have unilateral or bilateral projects like Nord Stream 2. We have energy reforms in Ukraine, for example. We have gas reform, we have wonderful energy gas act, we have energy act which is to be introduced, and we have this multilateral policy, and then we have unilateral policies where the countries, not only Germany or Poland, but also Hungary, undermine this policy of Eastern Partnership by, for example, having a separate deal with Gazprom on a case that something happens to gas transit to Ukraine.
No, I think we really need to define, of course, common rules of the game, whether that's Russia or whether that's China. And here again, I'm repeating myself, if the largest and most powerful member is not setting the right course and not setting the right examples, you can't expect that from the weaker political or economic countries to do that. So it's particularly up not just to the Commission, it's up actually to Germany to redefine those policies. And I'm a little bit more encouraged by the recent debates we have partly in Germany, which is related also actually to Nord Stream. You would hardly find any foreign policy expert in the CDU, in the FDP, in the Green Party who is in favor of actually the Nord Stream 2 parties. It's also quite interesting that all the politicians in these various parties who have experiences working in Brussels in the European Parliament or the European Commission, whether that's Mr. Schulz in the SPD, whether that's Mr. Lambsdorff in the Liberal Democratic Party, whether that are CDU politicians working in the European Parliament in the EPP, though they have a very clear understanding and very clear persuasion for themselves to follow here European policies and to set the right conditions on the German side for political solidarity. But we need certainly in the German case, as well as in other countries, much more discussions of that, and then clearly define the rules of the game. Otherwise, nobody is waiting on Europe. If we are ourselves dividing us up towards Russia or towards China, we become a historical footnote in the next century, no doubt.
Of course, I agree. We need to not to be divided, of course, or under divided impera rule. But we have also the other side, the Azerbaijani point of view and Azerbaijani great offer of Southern Corridor. What is the state of Eastern Partnership energy policy from your point of view, from the point of view of your country, of the projects we can make together, from the point of view of negotiations we are already having, because it's not only about Southern Corridor to Azerbaijan, but also maybe Turkmenistan. So we have a great opportunity to cooperate with our eastern, southern neighbor.
Thanks so much, Mr. Chairman. I would also like to thank Professor Schumacher for inviting and also giving follow to me in such a high-level event. Because of time limitation, I would like to focus on your question and then remove my intervention. As you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, I came from Azerbaijan, and Azerbaijan is single energy supplier country among EaP countries. We export energy, we don't import energy. So for energy definition for energy security is not the same with actually energy security in Europe. Even
you might be an energy security provider.
Yeah, I mean energy security for us is more like security for pipelines, which is the we several times discussed with in the NATO events. Coming back to Southern Gas Corridor, very briefly, I would like to mention two challenges with Southern Gas Corridor. First one is the economic challenge. As you know, the cost of the Southern Gas Corridor is more than 40 billion USD. It's the most expensive energy project in the world. And then the bilateral agreement on the Southern Gas Corridor was signed in late 2013. That time, crude oil price in the world market was higher than now, even the 1 year after. In 2014, crude oil price in the world market dramatically dropped, and income from exporting oil and natural gas for Azerbaijan has been dramatically decreased. So the 2013, when the agreement was signed, Azerbaijan received like 2-3 times more income from exporting gas than 2014 and even 2018. So the cost was the main challenge, and that time, and Azerbaijan borrowed money from EBRD, World Bank, to finance Southern Gas Corridor. And the second challenge is the political challenge. As you know, for the energy market, we have different stakeholders or different, let's say, players. One of the major stakeholders is Russia, and Russia was against realization and implementation of Nabucco project, and Russia was not happy for Southern Gas Corridor 2. But if you compare Nabucco project or initiative of Nabucco and also Southern Gas Corridor, final destination for Southern Gas Corridor is Italy, but final destination for Nabucco would be Central and Eastern Europe. We actually energy dependency is higher than Italy, Albania, and Greece. And Nabucco initiative was blocked that time by Russia, and then Southern Gas Corridor was actually supported by European Commission and also by Azerbaijan, and it was actually start implementing construction, and then Southern Gas Corridor is consisting of the 2 major pipelines. One is the TAP and TANAP. And Azerbaijan export natural gas to Turkish markets through TANAP, which actually we intend to export more than 7 billion cubic meters natural gas to Turkish market every year. And then TAP is, which is using TAP, Azerbaijan will export natural gas to European market. In the first stage, Azerbaijan will export 10 billion cubic meters natural gas to European market, and then in the second stage, Azerbaijan is going to increase volume of the natural gas which export to European market.
It's about Azerbaijan gas or this Turkmen gas, the second phase?
Second, I mean, if you look at the energy map of Azerbaijan, oil output in Azerbaijan has been decreased since 2011. But natural gas output in Azerbaijan has been increased. So Azerbaijan, 2018, Azerbaijan produced more than 40 billion cubic meter natural gas, which is higher than 2017. But the oil output actually has been decreased since 2011. So for total capacity of the Southern Gas Corridor is 31.5 billion cubic meter per year. So Azerbaijan is in the position to contribute more than 25 billion cubic meter natural gas per year. But of course, in order to fully implement of the second stage of the Southern Gas Corridor, Turkmenistan has to be joined to support or to join Southern Gas Corridor, because even natural gas output of Azerbaijan is enough to meet first stage, but for the second stage, Turkmenistan natural gas is very important to export through Southern Gas Corridor.
So when it comes to this energy trilemma that was mentioned by Professor Umbach, how would you describe the Azerbaijani approach to Eastern Partnership policy? Because we have a clear interest in energy security dimension, security of supply dimension, but how about other parts of this agenda, which is complete, which is undivisionable, and you cannot divide it? You know, you have also the climate policy, these marches that were mentioned. How about Azerbaijani approach to this part of Eastern Partnership cooperation?
I mean, Azerbaijan contribute energy security in Georgia. I mean, Georgia fully import natural gas from Azerbaijan. But because of the conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia, we don't have any energy cooperation with Armenia. But at the same time, Bulgaria is going to, Bulgaria is not part of, is not member of Eastern Partnership countries, but Bulgaria is going to use domestic chain to import Azerbaijan natural gas from top. But after Bulgaria, Ukraine and Moldova may actually import Azerbaijan natural gas. But it is needed more financial support. It's needed more political support from Brussels and also more technical support. So there is chance to export Azerbaijan natural gas to other EaP countries, but more financial support is needed.
So from your point of view, you need to have a bigger political umbrella, let's say, in general, from the European Commission over this cooperation, because when it comes to only companies, we have a situation like with Nabucco project. It was politically perfect. Everyone agreed that we need Nabucco project, but companies on the ground decided that they like South Stream more, for example.
Yeah, different. Brussels, position of Brussels is very important because such an initiative is not only needed financial support, but also needed political support from Brussels because it's like extension of the southern gas corridor to Central and Eastern Europe. There is political challenge because Russia is against extension of the southern gas corridor to Central and Eastern Europe, where Gazprom is more dominant. And at the same time, Azerbaijan is not in position now to finance extension of the southern gas corridor to Central and Eastern Europe. So support from Brussels, not only from financial support, but also, not financial and technical support, but also political support from Brussels is very important. Otherwise, it's almost not impossible to export Azerbaijan or even the Caspian natural gas to other EaP countries.
So there is a room for Eastern Partnership cooperation in this sphere, in this support when it comes to Southern Gas Corridor. But then I have only one question to you. Well, it is what you said before. What can we change in this policy? Just 2 words about what can we change in this Eastern Partnership policy in energy sphere for making it more efficient than it is for now. So, ladies.
In terms of the sustainability aspect, or in general?
In general, how to lead an energy policy towards Eastern partner countries. Like we've heard that we need higher support from Eastern European Commission. We need more financial support. What else?
Being realistic about
pragmatic, like we have in our topic indeed. Of discussion, yeah.
And ownership. We can demand as much support as possible, but if we don't enact and make these reforms happen, then that's perhaps what I would.
Two sides need to cooperate.
So I'm afraid we are lacking, as you can see, one panelist participant, and I think he would have
had energy community.
He would have had a great answer to this, so I will give it on his behalf, and that is the energy community participation. So a lot of the countries, Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, already are part of the energy community. That's point is to implement the third energy package, do the unbundling, bring these European regulatory frameworks to these countries. Armenia is an observer in this energy community as well. I think that's the point where we should start, and if the one thing we need to mention, the other is obviously what we have heard all day long is the transparency, anti-corruption, rule of law, checks and balances, so forth, civil society that we require.
Okay. So empower the energy community. I sign to this. So Professor Umbach, what do you say?
Firstly, continuing doing our homework. I think the energy community has done a great job, and I would definitely, definitely not put Ukraine in the same place as Belarus. I think Ukraine, by all shortcomings and corruption problems we still face, Ukraine made a huge progress in its energy, and particularly also of its gas reforms. Also thanks sometimes just to people. When you have a little bit information about the two very young CEOs CEOs of Naftogaz, and I know them personally, who had been educated at Western universities, who worked many years in the banks. They completely fired all department chiefs when they were taking up Naftogaz. They put all the people who had been corrupted in the past with all the proof to the government. And as Kovalyov said last year in a closed session of an expert discussion we had with him in Brussels, not one of those people where they had all put the proofs to the government had been put in prison up to date. The problem lies on the government and the parliament side, on the political side, rather than on the management side of Naftogaz. Remember, just one point, remember, we had 8 years ago an import dependency on Ukraine going up to more than 40 billion cubic meters annually from Russia. Today, in 2016, it did not import Russian gas at all. And I remember many discussions 1 or 2 years before, including many of my country colleagues as well as industry representatives, which have argued that Ukraine is just a troubleshooter. They should come to agree with the Russians because they have no other alternative than to import Russian gas. And Ukraine did it within few years, which nobody was anticipating. Of course, they imported their gas from Slovakia, from Hungary, and actually it turned out in reality this was also partly even Nord Stream gas.
But not on
which was not, certainly not right. The Russian intention, and it was too big also Russian anger. But in this respect, the reforms have made huge progress. They are not fulfilled, but the unbundling process is forthcoming if a new government is not stopping this process. But I'm a little bit more optimistic because all the international pressure from the EU side, from the European Bank, from the European Development Banks, as well as others, have put a lot of pressure on the Ukrainian government, despite their opposition, to go ahead with the reforms. Otherwise, nobody would be willing to invest or to grant any kind of money. And that has helped, as well as the high political attention of political leaders, including in Germany. And I wished that our political initiatives and support from the highest level would be also much bigger in respect to the neighborhood and EaP policies. That would definitely or could definitely change something if that strong political support from the very top, not just from the Commission side, but from the governmental side of member states, particularly the major ones such as Germany, such as France and others, would continue.
We see that we have a lot to do, but when it comes to the topic of our discussion, we won't depoliticize the topic for now. Yet, but we'll try, we'll do the best we can, but now it's time for the audition questions, comments, and I see hands. Lady over there first, please. Maybe we'll take 2 questions and comments and then more.
Thank you so much. I'm Anna, I'm a student of College of Europe, and my question is addressed to Mr. Bayramov. Taking into account the factor of Southern Gas Corridor and EU becoming one of the biggest markets for Azerbaijan, how can EU play that card and make reforms in Azerbaijan? Do you think it's realistic or no?
And the second question, over here.
Georg Bagdasaryan, student at College of Europe. So when we talk about energy security in the Eastern Partnership territory, geopolitically talking, I see another actor which can have a great influence on these countries. It's Iran. So what are the opportunities and trades coming from Iranian side as an energy actor? Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Bayramov.
Thanks so much for your question. Azerbaijan is also a major trade partner in EU in the region. 75% of the EU trade is with Azerbaijan. And EU is also very active in modernization of Azerbaijan economic system and also infrastructure. Regarding to reforms, of course, EU is a major active stakeholder in Azerbaijan. And energy cooperation between EU and Azerbaijan has a positive impact on reforms in the country. At the same time, now there is talks between Azerbaijan and EU to sign a new agreement, which is a strategic partnership agreement between Azerbaijan and EU. And the partnership agreement focuses not only energy and economic cooperation, but also reforms on political sphere, reforms on human rights, and also democratization. And I believe that energy cooperation between EU and Azerbaijan has a positive impact on the reforms in the country.
Okay, and when it comes to Iran, who wants to speak? Yeah.
I think a prerequisite for any successful Iran policies also on our side is to find a common sense also with the United States. As we don't have the transatlantic consensus at the moment because of the Iran sanctions issue, which is also dividing us, but it's also minimizing particularly the EU policies towards Iran. So the instruments we try to develop as an answer to the US side is not effective at all, because the bigger companies will not use these kind of instruments the EU offered, because if they are engaged on the US market, they will suffer on the US market much more than they would ever lose on the Iranian market, and therefore they go along with the official EU policies. So and that brings me to the larger picture, not just related to Iran, to the EAP policies in general. I think the EU policies, of course, would be much more successful, like it was in the case of the Southern Gas Corridor, if we have a transatlantic consensus. And
it was a clear consensus behind Nabucco, for example, right? We have US support, EU support.
Yes, I think the whole Southern Gas Corridor project, irregardless of the Nabucco fate, was only possible because of the strong US support of EU policies and going along with the strategic joint agenda we had in developing the Southern Gas Corridor, particularly also with Azerbaijan. If that is lacking, if the EU and the US is following unilateral policies, competing even with each other, rather to find a consensus, then we are only weakening by ourselves. And that's not just the fault, I think, of Mr. Trump. I'm seeing very critically, but I think we have also to address some of our own insufficient policies, and that refers also to our Iran policies, by the way. And I'm just coming back from a joint NATO Kuwait center and a training course on energy security, and I had been asked as a European representative very critical remarks by Kuwaiti officers in respect to our Iran policies. But I can tell you more.
Okay, so we have a problem with this division when it comes to Iran. I can only say 2 words about it, that Polish companies were negotiating long-term oil deals with Iran, and now they are not negotiating it. Yeah, and that's it. So we have a third question over there. Yeah.
Okay, I'm Denis Genja. I'm from Ukraine, young European ambassador. First of all, before I ask my question, I'm not an ecology activist and I don't know at all about energy, but nobody has mentioned at least something about alternative sources of energy. And I'm interested, and honorable experts, may you answer if we need at all to include the development of alternative sources of energy in the policies of Eastern Partnership countries. Thank you.
Could you specify what kind of alternative resources?
Any, maybe solar energy, maybe wind energy.
So renewables, for example.
Renewables, yeah.
So I can answer before the expert will answer that pursuing the renewables development is written into the Eastern Partnership, into the common energy and climate policy of EU, and into common policy towards Eastern Partnership countries. So what would you say about the renewables? Who wants to?
I think there are some countries who are actually going ahead with EU projects as well as without EU projects. And here again, one of the positive examples is actually Ukraine. Ukraine is doing a lot in wind power and solar power over the last years, and that was very much driven also by EU projects and funds. But we have here also a lot of investment actually on the Ukrainian side by itself. So in some countries it's going ahead. It depends on the government policies, but also by adapting the right regulations. And that's part of the energy community policy, which I strongly recommend to adopt those policies. And if those policies not going ahead, then it depends that these countries didn't have made their own homework.
Okay, so I can only mention the Chernobyl solar power plant project, for example. It's heavily published in media, and it's really interesting how Ukraine is taking its legacy and is using it to change the energy landscape. So I believe the change is happening, not so fast, or maybe somewhere it is getting faster or somewhere it is slower, but it is happening and it is required inside of Eastern Partnership policy. And there's 2 questions over here. And that's it, because we need to go for a coffee break.
Hello, my name is Elmir Badalov. I'm from Azerbaijan. I have a question for Mr. Bayramov and Professor Umbach. In his recent visit to Armenia, the Prime Minister of, in the recent visit to Iran, the Prime Minister of Armenia, Nikol Pashinyan, mentioned that Armenia can be a transit country for Iranian gas to Georgia. What do you think about Armenia's position as a transit country, and do you think Russia is going to block the project? Thank you.
Really tough question. And the second one, here it is, yeah.
My name is Vera Kompanidze. I'm from Ukraine. Thank you a lot for your discussion. My question probably for Mrs. Yulia Vainio. You spoke a lot about energy security, and I'm particularly interested in cybersecurity and energy. We know that the first well-known successful cyber attack on power grid was happened in Ukraine in 2015, and afterwards in 2016. And in 2018, we had a massive cyber attack on the US power grid from Russia's side. My question was, it like intention on purpose, or which is strategy of Russian Federation to attack power grids from like cyber side? Thank you.
Okay, so quick answers, please, Mr. Bayramov.
Thanks so much for your question. 2 points I'd like to mention here. First, actually, Azerbaijan has transit dependency from Georgia, because all pipelines from Azerbaijan go through Georgia. So Azerbaijan is going to is willing to diverse transit roads, but there is no alternative rather than Georgia. And Georgia has also import dependency from Azerbaijan, and Georgia import almost all energy from Azerbaijan. And Georgia is also willing to diverse import sources and reduce dependency from one source, even it's not Russia, even it is is Azerbaijan. Pipeline from Iran through Armenia to Georgia. There is negotiation between Georgia and Russia to import. Even to import Russian gas to Georgia. There's also negotiation between Georgia and Iran to import Iranian gas to Georgia through Armenia. I mean, it's really hard to say what reaction Kremlin would have, but what I can say actually, importing gas from Iran to Georgia, it's very costly because there is having like new pipeline from Iran to Georgia or Armenia, it will need more financial resources, and because the economic position of Iran and also since Armenia and Georgia, I mean the EAP countries are not rich in terms of financial resources, and Iran also face economic challenge now, and if I don't believe the both sides are ready to finance such a project. It will take a longer time than expected, but at the same time, reaction of the Kremlin is very important. And even the Armenian market is small, but Armenian market is very important for Russia. because Russia always use natural gas to influence on local decision-making process in the country. So Russia will try to keep its position in Armenian market, but even import natural gas from Iran to Armenian and Georgian market will take more time than expected.
Thank you very much. We'll see about that. In Ukraine, they lost the market eventually. 2 words, please.
I have nothing to add to what my Azerbaijani colleague was saying to that kind of point, but I just had forgotten to mention, and that goes back to your question of nuclear power. I'm not a typical German this way. I have never been against nuclear power as many of my countrymen. However, I'm skeptical at the moment, and that has more to do with the commerciality. All nuclear power projects in Europe at the moment, if you take the recent examples like Finland and others, we're completely running out of the costs. Planning. We have huge problems on the British side, where companies, recently a project had been finished, and the rest of the projects, other nuclear power projects, are highly uncertain whether they will ever be implemented because of the commerciality of costs and the dramatic decline of the costs of renewable energy sources, and also by taking into account that you need a lot of money to put in the reserve by decommissioning those reactors after 30, 40 years, as well as by the unresolved problem of storing nuclear waste. And if you take all these costs into account, it's so prohibitive at the moment that any government at the moment, including the Polish one, is very much struggling whether these projects can go ahead.
So we have a clear answer about that, and we have 1 minute for the answer about cyber attacks.
Thank you very much. I am not a cyber expert, but I will try to be very brief and very concise. So yes, up to 250,000 people were affected at times in Ukraine. Clearly, we do not know the strategy from Russia's side. It is unbeknownst to us, we can only guess. Ukraine has been considered widely as a test lab for hybrid means of activities, including the cyber power grid attacks. So we assume that this was a test bed, and we assume that there will be worse to come. Infiltration to the system usually happens months prior, so there is a months of probing, there's months of testing, seeing where the vulnerabilities are. Apparently all TSOs, transmission system operators in Europe and worldwide globally, experience these sorts of attacks on their systems constantly. Whoever, my colleague used to say, whoever thinks that they have not been infiltrated does not just know it, just doesn't know it. So everybody has
We'll see what happens next.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And one last thing I would like to mention quickly about cyber attacks is that it is a low-cost, high-reward game. So we don't know if it's a rogue actor. We don't know if it's a state actor. We know it's an open playing field. We know people are interested. We know entities are interested. And yes, Ukraine has been the test lab so far.
Okay, so as we need to finish, I will just say that the Eastern Partnership energy policy will be politicized, so we need a good policy to have a good Eastern Partnership. Thank you very much, my dear panelists, dear audience.